Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and our last Seniors Mental Health Supports webinar, and it is focused on managing burnout and stress. So thanks to everybody for joining. I'm told from my staff, we have 82 people who have joined. My name is Susan Taylor. I am the Deputy Minister of Seniors and Housing. And 82 people who have registered, representing a number of different areas: Alberta Health Services, FCSS, our housing providers, Caregivers Alberta, Saffron, some senior centers. And so very, very pleased that you were able to make time today to join us. I am equally pleased to be here with you and to introduce our minister. And unfortunately, she is not able to join us in person, as she is on tours across the province this week. In a moment, though, we will hear a video message from Honorable Josephine Pon, Minister of Seniors and Housing. Minister Pon was elected as MLA for Calgary-Bennington on April 16, 2019, and was appointed Minister of Seniors and Housing on April 30th. Her background and experience have given her personal insight into the current economic situation, especially the challenges faced by everyday Albertans. Mr. Pon has often spoken of the impact of the pandemic on Alberta seniors and also of their great resilience. The minister is committed to supporting seniors to reconnect and to re-enter society. The Seniors Mental Health webinar series is one tool to help seniors re-enter a post-pandemic world. And I can convey to you personally that our minister has been making this mental health webinar series a priority. She spoke to us several months ago about the importance of doing this. And I want to thank my team in Seniors and Housing for the excellent work that they've done and for all of the panel presentations that have been provided. And a welcome today to our panelist, Tim Neubauer. So on that note, now a message from our minister, the Honorable Josephine Pon.
Welcome to the Senior Mental Health webinar series. Many people have experienced increased stress and isolations during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had an effect on their mental health and wellness. This is particularly true for seniors, caregivers, and staff in seniors organizations. Our community partners have told me about these issues, and I have been listening. That's why I'm pleased to offer this webinar to support seniors, their caregivers, and staff as we begin to recover from the pandemic and reconnect with each other. This four-part series is focused on managing social isolation and getting help, reestablishing social connections, dealing with the grief and loss, and managing burnout and stress. I hope these webinars will help to ease people back into normal life, especially those who have experienced significant changes. We all have a role when it comes to supporting our own, each other's mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Now, I will hand things over to the mental health experts. Take care, be well, and stay safe.
Thank you, Minister Pon, and good morning, everyone. My name is Kessa Shikazi, and I'm the Executive Director with the Seniors Strategic Planning Branch in Seniors and Housing. I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's session. As was mentioned previously, this is the fourth and final webinar in our mental health series for seniors, and today's session will focus on resources for caregivers and service providers to support managing burnout and stress. Our panelists will draw upon the Canadian Mental Health Association webinar on overcoming mental health challenges in a global pandemic. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Just for your awareness, these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on our website. There will be a question and answer period following our panel presentations. If you'd like to pose questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And please note, if you prefer, there is an option to pose your questions anonymously. Any resources mentioned during the webinar will be available on our website. Okay, and on to our discussion for today. Today, our panelist is Tim Neubauer, Rural Mental Health Project Coordinator with the Canadian Mental Health Association. If you'd like, more information about Tim is available on our webpage. And now, Tim, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kessa. I'm going to actually now share my screen, so let me just do that. Hopefully everyone's now able to see just our title slide, Managing Burnout and Stress. And so what I want to do is give a sort of a quick outline here of what we're going to look at. As Kessa said, at the end of the webinar, we will have time for some questions. It's quite a topic that, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about burnout. And we could definitely spend more than an hour looking at it. And so we are going to sort of do more of a high level overview of the subject matter. And hopefully there'll be some things that we talk about over the next 30 minutes or so that will allow you to probably dig a little deeper and look at some more resources as well. And so we want to look at this morning, the understanding really the effects of this past year on our mental health and well-being. It's been quite a journey, which continues obviously, but the last 18 months, there's a lot of things that have gone on to understand the impacts of stress in the context of a global pandemic. Obviously, there's been elevated levels of stress in many people's lives. We want to look a little bit at the difference too between stress and burnout. Sometimes those words get used interchangeably. And so just, what is the difference and how do we recognize some of the signs, perhaps symptoms that we might be experiencing more stress or maybe even beginning to experience some symptoms of burnout. Also look at a brief definition of burnout. And then we want to conclude by looking at some ways that you and I might be able to deal with burnout to mitigate some of the impacts that it might be having on our lives, both personally and professionally. We know that, there's a lot of talk about, separating workplace and our home lives. And I think we've discovered this last year, especially that it's very difficult to do that. We definitely bring our workplaces home. And we've done that actually literally. Many of us have been working from home at some point, at least over the last year. And also we take our personal lives to work. It's very difficult for us to be able to separate that. And that really is a important part of who we are, is those domains of our life. We really, whether we're at home or we're at work, we are whole people. And so to separate that is actually quite difficult. So as Kessa said, I work for the Canadian Mental Health Association. I work for our provincial office, which is located in Edmonton, but I live in Calgary. And so we do a lot of work with the provincial government. We do advocacy work and work on a number of projects of provincial scope. So I've been able and had the privilege to be a part of several projects over the last number of years. Worked for a number of years looking at workplace wellness and just how do we create psychologically safer workplaces, and what does that mean, and what does that look like? Been able to support many organizations across the province. Currently working with our rural mental health team, and so we have had a chance over the last 3 years to work with over 100 communities, rural and remote communities across the province, looking at ways that we can support individuals in communities to really begin to do some grassroots action steps to support mental health and well-being in communities across the province. And so wonderful experience being able to do that. Part of what we talk about at the Canadian Mental Health Association is the importance of our lived experience and our living experience. And so many of you here today will come with your own lived experience. I myself as well have some experience with some mental health challenges in the past, specifically a number of years ago in the area of burnout, where I had to actually take a leave of absence from work for about 6 months. I thought it was a weekend. It was going to be a weekend, just getting a little extra rest. And it ended up being about 6 months for me to be able to recover from the effects of the job. And so I know that there's some of you here today that are working in some very challenging workplaces. Also, just some of the things that we do on a daily basis can definitely add additional stress in our lives. And so we want to look at the subject of stress and burnout because, some of us here are supporting people who may be experiencing added stress, who may be actually beginning to experience burnout. We're going to mention compassion fatigue a little bit, although the purpose of this webinar is not to go deeply into that subject matter, but I do want to mention because it is connected in some ways. And so we'll begin by looking at this slide. So again, welcome to everybody from across the province. Glad to have you here with us today. And so I really begin by asking what I call a very big question. How has the past 18 months impacted you? And I think we could probably spend considerable amount of time actually talking about that because the impact has been quite significant on all of us over the last 18 months. And so just really to look at this graphic, I want to explain a few things here because we've all gone through many multiple changes. I call them major disruptions over the last 18 months. And there's been a variety of things this past year that we've all had to adapt to and we continue to adapt to. And that includes both in our personal lives, as I mentioned, and also the impact it's had on us professionally. And so we've discovered that it takes a lot more energy to do things than before. And many people are experiencing additional anxiety as a result of the losses that have occurred and the constant change that we've gone through. I mean, it's been very difficult to settle into, how is life going to end up being when it continues to change for us? And some of us may even have experienced something which I call, brain fog over this last year, where there's been times where it's been harder to concentrate. It's been harder to focus. It's definitely been harder to do certain things, which before might have been a lot easier to do. And so if you'll notice the graphic on the screen, I mean, we've listed a few things there, and this comes from Dr. Deb Thompson. So thank you for her work in putting this together. But there were many things going on in our lives before COVID happened, and a multiple variety of feelings that we may have been experiencing. Now, what's happened over the last 18 months is for many of us, for many people, these have been amplified and even made more difficult. And as you see on the graphic, this has taken up quite a considerable large part of our brain, so to speak. And so what's left is the top right-hand side, really a couple of small pieces there. One small piece for coping with things that are going on, and an equally small slice available for what I would consider to be, our energy, our motivation, our focus. And so what this means for many of us is that we don't have as much gas in our tank, so to speak, to be creative, to be innovative. And we may have actually found it a lot harder to focus at times over the last year. And so we need to remember really, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but we are in really a marathon, not a sprint. And so it can be helpful even to begin with this graphic to support, people who might be asking, what is going on? How come I'm having trouble concentrating? How come I'm having trouble maybe doing some of the tasks that before were a lot easier? And why don't I have the motivation or the focus? And so this helps to normalize some of the experience that we are not just going through in Alberta, but globally as well. And so at times over this last year, I'm sure maybe you've even used the phrase or had the feeling that maybe you felt a little bit more off balance than before. And so when we think of our mental health and well-being, it's actually very normal for us to be pushed off balance from time to time, especially following what we'd consider, a natural or man-made disaster, a crisis, a global crisis like the pandemic, or any types of major disruptions in our lives. And so if you'll notice on the screen here, we have an individual, and there's 3 boxes on the left and there's 3 boxes on the right, would represent really some things in this person's life. On the left-hand side, we'd consider those, some of the supports in our life, the positive experiences in our life. And on the right, I would consider those, some of the negative experiences that we can go through. And so it would seem like it should be balanced, but here we see obviously someone that's, feeling off balance. And so when we go through like a global pandemic or a major disruption or even additional stress in our lives, we may find that some of the positive supports aren't working as well as they did before. And so we may feel that, these negative experiences do push us more off balance. And so how quickly you and I might, what we maybe consider restoring that balance, depends on a number of things. It depends on what we consider, internal factors. So how you and I cope with stress. And we want to look at that in a minute, just different ways that stress has impacted us. Our genetics can play a part of that, and obviously pre-existing physical challenges as well, though it's not just internal factors, it's also external. And so it's the many environments that we live, work, and play. It can also be the skills that you and I have learned to deal with stress or to deal with adversity. And so that's different for every one of us. If we were to think about regaining our balance, however, I would like to, look at it as, perhaps we can find different ways to increase those positive supports or to strengthen those positive supports, or maybe even add some additional supports that may be needed in our lives. And also to look at the negative experiences that we're facing And in particular, we're talking about, stress and burnout today. And so how do we deal with stress in more helpful or even resilient ways? Maybe we can even use the term growth promoting. And when we think of stress, one of the ways that we tend to think of dealing with stress is what I've put on the screen here, which we call stress relief. And so these are the things, this might be familiar to you or it might be new, but when we talk about stress relief, it's more of the things that you and I can do quickly and in the moment to reduce our stress. And so, even if you want to, picture a pressure cooker, if you've ever used that, the steam builds in that, and there's usually some kind of valve on the top that where the steam is able to escape and it kind of releases some of that stress or some of that pressure. So stress relief is the things that you and I do, maybe at the end of the day, someone has a glass of wine, or we're eating chocolate or we're watching Netflix. It's things really, again, more quick and in the moment, more accessible. And like a pressure cooker, it does help us to deal with stress in that it releases some of that stress and we feel better. The second thing, or the second way that often we look at dealing with stress, is what we call stress management. And so these are the things that I would say are more regular. So it's not so much quick and in the moment, but more regular and predictable ways for us to manage our stress. And this can be, again, multiple of different things. It's going to the gym for some people, might be going for a run or a walk. It can be mindfulness exercises, journaling, meditation. When we think about the context of, our global experience really over the last year, a lot of ways that people were dealing with stress in more regular and predictable ways really changed over the last 18 months. And many times it changed. Being in this global pandemic experience, it took away some of the ways that people dealt with stress. It changed some of those, and sometimes it was short term, sometimes it was more long term. And so you could see, that's definitely added additional stress in our lives, just the fact that we can't deal with stress in more of these manageable ways. And so I think the first two are pretty common. I want to add a third here, which may not be something that people often think about, but there's also what we call building longer term strategies. And so that's when we begin to maybe notice some patterns in our life. An example might be, if we begin to notice that every time we come to work, we're feeling elevated levels of anxiety, and really those stress levels are increasing, and it's become a pattern. Often stress relief is not working so well. And it really is never meant stress relief to be, something that we're doing all the time. It's more of something that we have in the toolkit that we can use when needed, just to kind of let that, like I said, that steam kind of go off, that eases some of the stress. We really want to focus on the stress management. But if I notice patterns in my life, that's really where I want to begin to build some of those longer term strategies to deal with stress. That's where maybe I might want to, go speak to a mental health professional. Maybe it's to speak with, a friend and begin to brainstorm, or even your manager at work, to brainstorm some ways to, deal with, what's going on at work. It might be I need to just take some, courses or develop some new skills, some things to, again, just help me to deal with what's now become a pattern in my life, and really to begin to work through this in a longer term way. So as you're listening, this morning, maybe just make note, what are some things that you do to deal with stress that's more of quick and in the moment? Definitely we want to have those in our toolkit, but really to focus on, are there some things that I need? And we're learning as we look at the, even the visual again, that we've had to add perhaps some more things. Some things maybe didn't work as well. Some of our coping strategies maybe weren't working quite the same as they used to. And so this past year, we've had to add some other supports into our lives to deal with stress. And definitely that goes into what I've talked about as far as a longer term strategy as well. And so in particular context of the global pandemic, we've experienced definitely some different types of stress. And so I want to talk about some of those. You'll notice the headings on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is quite common, when people go through natural man-made disasters and perhaps the loss of life, someone passes away, we can often experience what we call spiritual stress. But definitely going through something like a global pandemic, we've experienced this, where people begin to ask some of these more existential questions, bigger life type questions, things like, what is my purpose and who am I? what is my life going to look like 3 months from now, 6 months from now? And of course, there's been so much change, it's hard to answer those questions. So it's caused spiritual stress for people. We've experienced social stress. Just the changing ways that we've been able to relate, the loss of our relational supports for some people, has caused a lot of social stress for people this past year, past 18 months. We think of physical stress, obviously, we've learned how to adapt sometimes rather quickly. And so for many people, it was, kids, and we were working from home and a full house and trying to adapt to all the different changes that has created obviously some physical stress. Just even working in I have quite a small workspace at home. And so I've had to adapt to that. And for some, it's been even illness, experiencing illness this past year has caused physical stress for sure. And the mental stress too, which I don't have to explain. But, just even before the pandemic arrived, last, whenever it was March here in Alberta, when we really began to go, something is happening here on a global perspective. It's now affecting us here in Alberta. There was a lot of things going on in our world before that. We've had climate disruption and just the stress that's brought on. I've really noticed just the pervasive undercurrent, even of fear, that we've been exposed to even before the pandemic occurred. And so it's created a lot of mental stress for people. A lot of economic uncertainty, even in our own province, we've experienced that. And so there's been a lot of things going on, and it's understandable that our stress levels have definitely been elevated over the last 18 months. And so when we think again of that stress, it is understandable that it would increase because a lot of negative experiences may have increased in people's lives. And as I said already, we've lost some of those positive supports that maybe, again, things that we were able to do, we were able to cope with stress and manage stress. It was harder to do over the last 18 months. And so we understand that, it is absolutely normal to experience acute stress from time to time. And we've all had that experience this past year. Those sort of, again, I don't want to call it one-off events, but it's these events that happen that can be very stressful for our lives. But it sort of happens, and then we find a way to work through it. We use some of the tools in the toolkit, some of our resiliency skills to work through that. And it can be an argument with our partner, it could be criticism from our boss, it could be a car accident. I mean, there's a lot of different examples of acute stress, but again, it happens. And we're able to work through that. We're quite resilient as individuals. And so we do work through these examples of stress, even when they happen a bit more frequently and become more episodic. We find ways to work through that. I'm discovering, I don't know if you've discovered this too, that, often I'm self-imposing pressure. And I've done that actually this past year, where I've put more external demands on myself than we're actually being placed. And it's created, stress definitely in the workplace. What I want to notice is, or definitely make note of, is that last category there, and just, when it becomes more chronic stress, it can cause different challenges for us for sure. It's when that stress doesn't go away. It's not, we're not able to work through it. It's where we're feeling off balance and we're not able to restore that balance as easily. I like to think of it as, and this is an example, hopefully everybody's had the opportunity at one point, in a lake or definitely the ocean, to step into that ocean. And, we experience the waves as we begin to step into the ocean. Maybe we're just 3 or 4 inches in. Those waves don't exert a lot of pressure on us. We can feel the impact of that wave. I mean, it feels kind of nice standing there in the ocean, but we don't really feel off balance. And we can kind of stand there all day, really. The deeper that we go into the ocean and those waves get larger, or at least the impact is felt, greater impact on us, it's harder to keep our balance. And that really is a good way of explaining chronic stress. It's when those alarm bells, those fight, flight, or freeze alarm bells in our brain really don't go off. They're continually ringing. And so it's like those waves continue to push against us, and we just never seem to regain our balance because we're always being pushed off balance. And so there's multiple stressors that people might experience to push them off stress that become chronic, unhappy relationships, unwanted career changes, the stress for some people of poverty, chronic illness, the political problems people might be experiencing, dysfunction in family units. And so there's a lot of things that can push us off balance. And the problem is when we're really not able to restore that balance over time. That can create multiple challenges for individuals and definitely affects our mental health and well-being. And so the good news is for many people that, if we can increase positive supports, if we can find ways to manage some of those negative consequences, if we can more effectively work through stress, we do recover and get back what I would call our what would be our personal or individual balance. If you're finding it challenging, and there might be some of you here today that are listening, that are going, boy, it seems like stress is more chronic. It seems like I'm being pushed off balance and I'm not able to really regain that, or some of the things I've used in the past, they maybe aren't working so well. I would encourage you to reach out, for some other types of support. That might be just reaching out, to talk to a counselor, to really maybe work through some of those deeper reasons why we might be experiencing stress, for example. And there's multiple other types of support that we can use, and I want to talk about some of those in a few minutes here. And so, as I said earlier, like stress is used a lot, the word stress, but also burnout. We want to talk about burnout. And so these words can be used interchangeably, but there is a difference. And I want to begin to look at, because even compassion fatigue gets thrown into the conversation. Stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, those actually all three can describe quite different experiences. There is some overlap. And so very simply here, when we're experiencing greater levels of stress on the left-hand side, it's really, we begin to put in a lot of more effort. We might feel actually emotions more strongly. We can feel elevated levels of anxiety, hyperactivity, and we have less energy. And we really do find that it can take quite a physical toll on our mental health, but also on our physical health as well. On the right-hand side, when we think of burnout, and I'll define burnout in a minute here a little bit more, but it's difficult to put in effort. It's really our emotions often will feel more blunted. I'll feel drained and I'll feel actually helpless sometimes. And I experienced that, as I mentioned, about 8 years ago. I went through that experience of having to leave because of burnout, and just really felt like I just couldn't get anything done. I felt drained all the time. A weekend off or even a couple extra days off was not helping to refill that inner tank, and really feeling helpless to really change anything in my life. So there was less motivation I experienced, and this also you see on the screen is you might have less motivation. And where stress really has quite a physical toll, it can take quite a physical toll on us. We find that burnout often has quite an emotional toll on individuals. In fact, Mental Health America, which is the equivalent to Canadian Mental Health Association, it's really in many ways our sister organization in the United States, recently did a report that they published, a survey that they republished, the report called the Mind the Workplace Report. And so in those survey findings, they found that, and this is no surprise to anyone here today, but the pandemic really amplified what were a lot of pre-existing issues for employees, including increased risk for workplace stress and burnout, and the degradation of mental health and well-being. And so when we think about stress, what they found was that about 9 in 10 employees report that their workplace stress was indeed affecting their mental health. About 3 in 5 employees said that they were not receiving adequate support from supervisors to help them manage the stress that they were experiencing. And when we think of burnout, about 4 or 5 employees said they felt emotionally drained from their work, which we've said already, but we'll look at as really can be an early sign of burnout as well. And so let's take a little bit of a closer look at burnout. When we think of defining burnout, here's a definition that comes from the ICD version 11 or the revision 11, which is the International Classification of Disease. If you're familiar with that, or even in North America here, similar, we would have the DSM-5, states that burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and often physical exhaustion brought on by prolonged or repeated stress. So it's not simply just a result of working longer hours. And they say it's an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that is not successfully being managed. And so, as I said in an earlier slide, acute stress, even episodic stress, we're able to work that through. When stress becomes chronic, it really can have some impacts. One of those impacts being it can cause burnout. And so simply put, it's characterized really by 3 dimensions. It's really where we might be feeling that energy depletion or exhaustion and we're not able to, as I said earlier, do things to refill the tank, so to speak. The gas tank is always empty. We begin to experience what we call mental distancing from our jobs. There's a lot of maybe cynicism that creeps into the workplace, into the job that we're doing. And definitely we experience reduced professional efficacy, where we feel like, what difference can I make? And we really feel that no matter how hard I'm working, I'm just not able to do the job anymore. I'm not able to do what I once was able to do. And so I like to look at this also, to add this to our definition, because I believe that burnout can also be a state of, fatigue or frustration that can also be brought on by devotion to a cause or a way of life, or even a relationship that failed to produce an expected reward. And so I can often think back, to my own experience, where I probably tended to perceive that the resources I had available were less, and really everything became more overwhelming in my life. And so whether it was real or not, I perceived that what I had to do was more and more. I had to work harder, I had to do more, and I had very few resources, even though I probably had more resources than I realized. So for me, that overwhelm and the perception that it just got harder to do everything, and that I wasn't being supported in the workplace, definitely did lead to burnout in my life. And so it's a process. It's not something that happens, overnight. It's definitely not something that, everything seems to be going fine, and then tomorrow you wake up and you're completely burnt out, so to speak. It's a process. It can definitely progressively become worse if there is no reduction in demands, and if we don't find ways to mitigate the effects that it's having on us. And so when we talk about symptoms, I want to talk a little bit about what might be some of the symptoms that we could experience as we begin to experience burnout, but definitely recognize that many of these symptoms do overlap and can be similar to other mental health challenges that people can experience. So we want to be careful that we don't become too diagnostic with this, but it gives us a bit of a snapshot, in a way at least, to check in with ourselves. And also, as we begin to recognize some of this, not only in ourselves, we can perhaps have some conversation with coworkers as well if we see some of these things happening around us. So it gives us a good place to start. And so physical signs and symptoms, talked about, some of those already, but, we feel tired and drained most of the time. We can definitely get more frequent illness because of the effect that it's having on us physiologically. People might have more aches and pains, definitely affects our appetite and our sleep habits. When we think of emotional signs and symptoms, might be feeling, a sense of self-doubt or even failure, feeling helpless, trapped, and defeated. That was one for me that was quite significant. It was feeling like I was trapped in the job I was doing and there was no way out. We might feel detachment, where we feel like isolated and alone in the world. That loss of motivation, so harder to get up in the morning, harder to do the things that before were not so challenging. The cynical or negative outlook, again, we might project that onto our jobs, and it might also be the way that we work with clients that we're serving, where we become more cynical, and definitely a decreased satisfaction in even our sense of accomplishment in the course of our work. When we think of behavioral signs and symptoms, people might withdraw, might isolate from others, and some of that is a protective mechanism, where best way I can say is that I just felt that everybody was taking from me and I had nothing left to give, and I wasn't able to refill the tank. And so I began to isolate. I began to withdraw. I began to actually not answer the phone or keep the door closed more, because for me, other people that were either coworkers or clients that I was working with represented to me, anyways, at a subconscious level, that here was someone else that was going to take, that was going to withdraw. And it was harmful for me. And so it was a way of protecting, really, that isolation. Procrastination can be a sign, using other things to maybe cope that were before we haven't used those things, or increasing the usage, like a food, drugs, alcohol, a number of different things. We can take our frustrations out on others, definitely become, like I said, emotions can become blunted, but we can also flip between emotions quite quickly too. And this is where we begin to see what we call, presenteeism or absenteeism in the workplace. So either people are calling in sick more, or people are there, but emotionally they're checked out. And I know in the questions, some questions were asked, or people brought in questions, I guess, when they registered. Definitely a question came in about compassion fatigue. It's another subject probably that we really don't have time to talk about that in detail in this webinar. I've been doing compassion fatigue workshop training for over 5 years now. And so it is an important subject matter because it does affect certain people and certain jobs. When we think of the difference though, real quickly here is that with compassion fatigue, it's more about our exposure to trauma and suffering, where burnout is a little different. And so compassion fatigue is not, as some people understand it or misunderstand it, I guess I would say, where we just have lost compassion. I think we can still maintain that compassion. It's just our empathic response is short-circuited because of the work and because of what we're experiencing in the workplace. A big part of that is the secondary trauma that people might be experiencing personally and professionally. And so when we talk about burnout, if you're in a job where there really isn't a lot of secondary trauma, chances are compassion fatigue is not going to be such a risk. But burnout can be a risk in any job for sure. And so a little bit of a brief definition here, but hopefully that helps to explain the difference between stress. Stress is a big part of it, can play a part of it, especially when it's unaddressed. But there's some different elements in play for sure when we talk about burnout. And so I want to conclude here as we sort of begin to wrap up the portion of our webinar before we go into our question time by looking at some ways to deal with burnout. I'd call it, how do we mitigate the impact on our life? We won't be able to eliminate all stress, obviously, and we don't want to. Some stress is actually good for us, and we need stress in our lives. But definitely we want to look at that stress that is at least becoming a little bit more chronic, where we begin to see ourselves pushed off balance, and where we may be beginning to feel some of those things that we already talked about when we look at burnout, where we just are beginning to check out. I actually had to change the alarm on my phone because every time I heard the alarm on my phone, it triggered a lot of different responses in me when I was going through my own personal burnout journey. And so through my recovery, I changed the ringtone because the ringtone reminded me of that I was, having to get up to a job that I really didn't want to go to. And so it helped to make some of those changes. So I want to look at some things here to help us both personally and professionally. And many of us will be doing some of these things already. And so for some, it might just be a reminder to continue to do these. But we definitely want to recognize the signs. Often it's easier, for someone else to point out some of those things. I know for me, I didn't see a lot of those things. And it was other people in my life that began to say, hey, I'm noticing some change. I'm noticing that you're not, your usual self. Again, the language we've used today is, I'm noticing maybe that you're a little bit more off balance from what might be normally you. So definitely that awareness is important, to recognize those signs, to recognize when things are changing in our lives, to recognize that in coworkers as well. And so we've mentioned these already, but just as a reminder again, really the key, I would call some of those three big signs, I guess, would be that emotional sign where it just feels like we're going through the mud. We're drained, unmotivated, tired, physically and psychologically. And has that increased? And is that increasing? I guess would be a way to look at it. The depersonalization piece, I think, is really big. A lot of us do work with people in our jobs. Probably most people do. And so, what begins to happen, for example, that nurse might refer to the patient as heart attack in room 8, as opposed to just as a person or individual. Psychologist maybe might refer to the client as that OCD guy. And we begin to depersonalize the clients or the individuals that we work with. And that definitely is a sign we want to watch for. And losing the ability to focus, where it was taking more time and energy to do my job, but I was accomplishing less. And so often what people will do is they'll tend to work longer and longer hours, which you could see puts us in a cycle that's not very helpful. We also want to recognize here too, when we talk about, just awareness, is that burnout can in some ways feel similar to depression. And I mentioned, when we look at symptoms, there is an overlap. One of the differences, I guess, in the time that we have, just very simply here, is that burnout tends to be more situational, whereas depression is more all-encompassing. And so depression tends to, if you've worked with individuals or even experienced that yourself, it tends to color every area of our lives. Whereas burnout tends to be, and I guess it's a bit of a simplification here, but it tends to be more job specific. And so definitely we want to recognize the signs. We want to start with the physical, which, I mean, sounds quite obvious, but what begins to happen is that when we begin to feel off balance, we can sometimes swap out some of those good habits. So some of those positive supports, we can either change those and add some that aren't so helpful, or we stop doing some things that were helpful. And for whatever reason, now we're not doing those. And it puts us in a bit of that cycle again. And so to stop and maybe take an inventory and say, how am I sleeping? Am I exercising? Am I getting enough physical exercise? I know for me, that's very key. And I really do begin to notice when I'm not doing enough exercise. I can feel, my body really doesn't deal with some of those chemicals very well, the stress chemicals that are produced, and exercise really helps me to deal with that. And so I can feel the effects physically begin to, when I'm not doing the exercise, for me at least. Proper nutrition, all of this can help us deal with stress, and definitely has an impact on mood. Also thinking about screen time. I mean, so much of this past year, we've moved more on screens, even more so than ever. And there's been, research done that shows, too much screen time obviously messes with our sleep cycles, can leave people feeling a lot more tired, headaches, fatigue, all these kinds of things. And so when we think of starting with the physical, definitely looking at, what am I doing to cope? What am I doing, to deal with stress in my life? What are some of the ways that, those positive supports, have I swapped some of those out? It's tempting if you're feeling, that mid-afternoon crash, just to eat more sugar, recognizing though that gives us a boost, but then generally speaking, we feel a lot worse if that's the way we're dealing with things. And so looking at, as I said earlier, not just stress relief, but intentional stress management and building longer term strategies. I want you to look at and think about and consider, this third one here, to redesign our work habits. It's very important to think about the workplace, to think about our own workplace habits, how that might be affecting us, to begin asking questions like, what does your job require? What are you putting on yourself, and what is your job actually requiring of you? And that can be very different for people. How much control are you, or do you have? What don't you have control over? Those are good questions to begin to ask. Do we have a hard time delegating or getting help on things? And some people do. Or are we obsessed because we tend to be maybe more perfectionistic? And so, we want to ask those questions, because if we tend to procrastinate a lot, it might be because, we're doing things last minute, and that has been beginning to be an effect on us, and maybe the root of our burnout. If we feel like we've taken on too much, and I was doing this, where I was taking on too much, I wasn't assigning enough things to others, and delegating. And so that was definitely having an impact on me. And so maybe working through with your manager might be helpful. Maybe even envisioning, what would be a mentally healthy workplace for you, or, workplace that is definitely, not so much. I like to say, often we think about what can I do after work to recharge my battery, but what can we do actually in the workplace during the course of our workday to find ways to recharge our batteries? And so, we want to keep doing what we love doing, jobs that maybe we're doing that we love for a long time. And so we don't want burnout to take us out of that. And so it really requires some strategy there. I know one of the questions that came in before the webinar was about Zoom fatigue. And I think a lot of us have experienced that. And I just, created a little list here. I say, let's give people permission to turn off the video. And since I've been able to do that in meetings, that's really helped, because for some reason, I'm not trying to, get all those cues from all the screen images on screen. And it's been less stressful because there was so much Zoom in our world anyways. Schedule phone meetings, take long enough breaks between your Zoom meetings, limit the number of Zoom meetings. And I'm really trying to find ways, how do we have those water cooler conversations, which I know a lot of us are going back to or have gone back to the workplace, but we really missed out on those water cooler conversations for sure. So how do we do that and spend time with people, having those more, I would call them more like casual conversations where we're not just jumping right into the work conversation. We want to also diversify our lives outside of the office, and really begin to check, what are some of the energy drains? What are some of the things that are taking away energy? And what are really more importantly, even more importantly, I think, is what are some of the things that maybe I've stopped doing that I need to start back doing or adding, that really, I guess, help you to charge your own inner battery, which is important. Whenever possible, we have to find ways to maybe separate our work life. I know we can't actually, there's no way to actually separate work and our personal lives because they do bleed together, but really more of that transitional ritual where we know that we're leaving the office, so to speak, and now we're at home, and we're going to charge our batteries. Problem with me, and I'll just share this quickly here, is that for me, really, my identity was very strongly tied in the work that I was doing. And so for me, that's why the risk of burnout went up, because my job was really who I was. And that 6 months off, really a forced leave from work, I didn't choose that, but really helped me to separate that I'm not my job and I do have a personal life, and the world isn't going to fall apart if I'm not there at the office. And so there's a lot of things I had to learn the hard way, that really now that, I think has been quite helpful even this last year. How do you transition? What are those rituals that we lost this last year from going from work to home? And then finally, to really know when you really need to get away. And again, it's other people that may have to tell us that. Sometimes we don't see that in our own lives. But if we're at the point where we're sacrificing our health or our relationships for our work, I think it's time to pause and probably say, what do I need to change here? Definitely if we're seeing, health changes happening to us, it's important. We are more than our work, and there's so much more to our lives than the workplace. And so finding, a mental health day, finding a way to talk about our mental health at work, opening up safer spaces so that as coworkers, we can talk about that, and maybe even do a check-in where I can, if I notice something about a coworker, say, I'm noticing this about you, and are you doing okay? Is there anything I can do to help? Maybe ways that we can step in to be more supportive. And giving people permission to ask us some difficult questions might also be helpful as well. And so I noticed that we're here kind of at the end of our time. And so a lot of information for sure, for a subject that we could spend a lot more time talking about. But hopefully it's a bit of an introduction to some of you here, or at least a reminder of some of the things about stress and burnout. As we begin to return back to maybe some more normal routines in our lives, as the world begins to, I guess, quote unquote, become more normal. I know that's a phrase. It's definitely, things aren't going back to normal, but it's more of what we're used to, I guess. Definitely love this quote by Dave Hollis, where he says, it's definitely, we want to continue to ask questions. Where do we want to focus? Where do we want to spend our time? What do we consume? How do we work? What matters? What doesn't? And I think that really plays well into our subject of managing stress and burnout, so that we do learn some lessons from this global experience that can not only support us now, but into the future. And so thank you, everybody, for listening today, for being part of this webinar. We're going to open it up for some questions. I may not be able to answer your question, so I may have to respond back if that's the case, but we definitely have time to take a few questions. Kessa is going to help me with that. So there might be some questions that came in the Q&A, and we also have some questions that came in before the webinar as well. And so I'll just kind of open it up now. If anybody does have questions, if you need some clarity on something, if you missed something that I said and you want that repeated, happy to do that as well.
Thanks, Tim, for the great presentation. I know a lot of what you said really resonated with me, both professionally and as a parent, and sort of, I think, with our collective and shared experience over the last year and a half. So thank you very much. As Tim said, we'd like to open it up for some questions. And as a reminder for folks, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and I will just be reading them off. So one of the questions that's come in is related specifically to caregivers. And so you talked a lot about the workplace. And I think for many of the folks on the line, that will certainly resonate. But what happens if you're caring for a loved one and you don't necessarily have a workplace and you can't distance yourself in the same way as you might be able to from a work environment? Are there any strategies or commentary that you'd like to make related to the needs of caregivers specifically?
For sure. And I speak more out of personal experience here. And so I was caring for someone a number of years ago who was going through a mental health challenge. And so it was overwhelming. I want to start by saying, for me, it was definitely an overwhelming experience. And I did have, it wasn't, you mentioned some people maybe aren't working full time. I was working full time and also had to do this additional caregiving role. And so a number of things helped. One was definitely I needed to have my own, I called it my own therapeutic community. I needed to have people that I could talk to about things, that I could just even offload, de-stress, just people that could input into my life. So that was very key. I had to become very intentional about also doing things to keep myself in a space where I was mentally healthy. Even though I felt guilty often doing that, because I felt like by taking time for myself, I was taking time away from the individual I was caring for. And so found that though that actually helped me to be a better caregiver. So I had to find ways to, I know everybody's different here. And so for me, there was ways I could get away, either go to gym or go for a walk, or there was things I needed to do to recharge that inner battery, because it was getting too drained, and I just knew I couldn't continue in that space. So definitely, it sounds selfish, but it's definitely not selfish to take care of yourself, to find ways to charge up your inner battery, to not take on that role, where I felt like at times I had to be the one to provide all the care, or I needed to do things to fix the individual. I started to step in that space to realize that probably, it's a team that's going to help this individual. I'm part of that team, but I need to make sure there's other players on that team that are going to be supportive. And it's not just about me to give that care. And I know I'm talking about it more on a mental health perspective. Some people here, it's more of a physical caregiving role. And so those are different challenges because it might be someone that you're physically caring for. So that's a quick answer. I mean, those are three things that definitely I had to be very intentional about. And it was very easy for that to go by the wayside too. So it was constantly, I had other people saying, are you doing this? Are you continuing to do this? There's some accountability in my life, because it was easy for me to forget about it, or just to feel guilty for doing some of those things. So hopefully that begins to answer. It's a longer question, and definitely a more robust conversation to have around that. But we can't take care of other people if our own battery is drained.
Thanks, Tim. And I just wanted to highlight for folks, there is some information on Caregivers Alberta that's been posted in the chat function, and they're a great resource, particularly for caregivers. You talked a little bit about depression, the differences between burnout and sort of and depression, and that oftentimes burnout is job specific. And again, just on the topic of caregivers, just wondering, if you're caring for a spouse, so if I'm a senior caring for an elderly partner, spouse, and I can't leave, is there any way that, or are there any things that people should be mindfully looking for or aware of, just to sort of manage that potential movement away from, burnout, because it's not really a job that you can leave, and into depression? Is there anything specifically that people should be looking for?
Again, that's a question that there's a lot to that question. So I think going back to the earlier question, I mean, looking at maybe respite, there's things that you would need to build into to support you and to support the individual that you're caring for. So that's a big part of it, and we want to revisit that for sure. I think for me, and I was again speaking more, I don't have a clinical background, but speaking more from my own personal experience, when I was going through some of the symptoms that I didn't understand, I mean, that's really where I had people in my life say, you need to do this, and they forced me to do it. So I went kicking and screaming to see my doctor. So it was a medical professional that I was seeing. I also was seeing a counselor on a regular basis. And so I had people in my life that, and I wasn't a caregiver for someone in my home. In my role, I was a caregiver for many people. And so that was part of the problem, was I wasn't caring for myself. And so I think if I didn't receive that support, potentially I would have gone to a place that was probably a lot more challenging and difficult for my mental health. But because I kind of addressed it earlier, so that to answer the question, Tessa, it's you might need to have some people again on your own team. I would definitely say it would be great to talk to a therapist or counselor that can kind of you can begin to talk about some of this, that can maybe notice when some things are shifting and changing, because we can feel pretty helpless pretty quickly if it's long-term care. And many people are in a longer-term care role where we're not talking weeks and months, but we're talking years. And so I'm not really able to speak to, because I don't do a lot of work with clients at the moment, especially older adults, but I suspect there's a lot of resources through, Ministry of Seniors and Housing and other, I think on the sheet that we're able to give people, there's a chance to connect with other resources that would probably be more supportive in creating that therapeutic community or team for someone, so that you don't begin to cross over from, maybe just feeling symptoms of burnout where it becomes a more serious mental health challenge, perhaps for somebody. So early intervention would be my answer, just to support, because it's difficult. It is very difficult to be in that place, and we're not superhuman, and we all have limits, and I didn't know what my limit was. I got too close to the limit, and I was able to get support to help me to come back to balance. But some people, stretch that elastic band. It's overused, but we stretch it too tight, and then sometimes it breaks, and it can be a more severe mental health challenge for sure. It doesn't mean it's a mental illness, but we can experience definitely some symptoms of depression. So I know that's a vague answer.
Thank you, though. There's probably not really a specific one thing that you can do, but I appreciate your comments. And you did reference the information sheet that we do have posted on our website, and there's lots of great resources there if people are looking for additional help and support. I'm just mindful of time, so I will wrap up for today. Tim, earlier on in your presentation, you talked about how this really is a marathon rather than a sprint. And when I think about a marathon, I think about all of the people who support the person that's running. You've got people on the sidelines cheering them on. You've got people on the sidelines giving them water. There's a whole community of support. And I think throughout this webinar series, we've talked a lot about that, the importance of checking in with yourself, but also checking in with the people that are in your lives, and whether that's seniors or your work colleagues or whomever that might be, that really is what's going to get us all through this together. So that's my reflection for today. And I, again, just really want to thank you for the great presentation. I'm very grateful to our Minister Pond, for hosting this important series. And just for folks, if you've missed the first 3 webinars, which were focused on mental health and supports for seniors, focusing on the future and grief and loss, they are all posted online. You can visit the same link that's been posted in the chat box, and you can find recordings as well as the presentations. And again, as I mentioned, the mental health resource listing. We will be posting this webinar on our website shortly, so you can send it on to colleagues or view it again if you'd like after today. Upon exiting this webinar, there's a short voluntary survey that you may wish to complete. The results of the survey will help us to inform the development of future webinars. Again, I want to thank everybody, and Tim especially, for taking time out of your day today. Hopefully you've learned some strategies that can help you cope with stress and manage your own mental health before anybody moves into a state of burnout. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.